So tonight at the Active Travel Cafe, we will start with our usual crowdsourced news update. We're going to try and keep that quite short tonight because we're going to finish a little bit early. And we want to have plenty of time to hear from our speaker and ask him questions. And our speaker tonight is John Parkin, who is Emeritus Professor of Transport Engineering at the University of the West of England. And he's going to talk to us about educating engineers. So before we hear from John, does anybody have any news from around the country that they would like to share with us this week? Did I see Veronica? Did you see you waving? Go for it.
Yes, it was. So I'm from Harrow in northwest London, which is notorious as a really poor area for cycling. And the council has recently passed an active travel motion, including, I know, it's amazing, including an intention, and I'll say no more than that, to put a cycle lane down our principal artery, which we've been campaigning for absolutely years.
Well, that's lovely news. Thank you for sharing that. Mark, have you got something?
Well, on that, I've just remembered I was supposed to send Veronica all the work that we did in Harrow a long time ago, and I haven't done it. So that's made me upset that I've forgotten to do it. So I apologise, and I will do it. I was at the Green Party conference with a few other people, and we had a very good presentation from Emily Kerr, who's well known to these parts, about it was about disinformation, misinformation, disinformation, active travel, but obviously quite a lot on East Oxford. I'm working on Oxford's Mini Holland stuff right now at the same time as listening to you. So there's stuff happening on that. And I know that if there's Oxford people here, I don't want to steal their thunder, so I'll let them explain what's happening in Oxford.
Thank you, Mark. Gary?
Hi. Something weird and unusual has appeared in Canterbury, and we're not quite sure why. I'll just pop a little link in. But it's part of an active travel fund too, for everybody who remembers that, which is still undelivered in Kent. It appears to have an informal zebra and parallel cycle crossing on an A road. We're not quite sure if Kent Highways are just making it up as they go along, or if they've actually been given permission to try all this. So just sharing the tweet where people can take a look.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, I saw that on Twitter. Very strange. Does anyone else have anything to share? Tim?
Hi, everybody. My favourite hobby at the moment is watching videos on Twitter of drivers saying they're having to drive at 20 miles an hour, and that group of cyclists in front of them, they can't even overtake them because they're doing 20 miles an hour. And I'm doing 20 miles an hour and I can't overtake them. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's supposed to be what's happening. It's a joy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Adam?
Just to say that the Cycle Streets Net has updated with the 2022 Stats 19 data, so their collision data is quite up to date. I'll put the link in the chat, but I think it can be quite useful to showing, some people have looked at it and showing, when a road was 30 miles an hour, the last 8 years when it's 30 miles an hour versus when it was 20 miles an hour, and seeing some big differences. So, but you can use it to play around and do dates. So if you know a particular dangerous junction or something like that, you now have even more data to play with. If that's useful, I'll put that in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Yeah, that would be great. Has anyone got anything else? Any news from Oxford? I don't know if we've got anyone from Oxford here this week. No.
I thought Danny was here. I tweeted him something, so I don't want to. I mean, I will speak for Oxford if necessary. If
nobody's coming forward, Mark, so why don't you? Oh, no, I can see a wave. Danny.
Okay, so what's the news in Oxford? The decision on our last round of 3 experimental low traffic neighbourhoods is next week, Tuesday next week. So it's a full cabinet meeting. Not too concerned about that because one consequence of Labour falling out with the Liberal Democrats is that the cabinet is almost entirely Liberal Democrat, and that's brought a whole wave of very committed active travel proponents into the cabinet. So I would say 6 or 7 of them are, hardcore active travel supporters. our concern is that they want to allow taxis through several routes in those LTNs, and that in the officer's recommendation is that be allowed. So we'll see how that is decided. It's possible they might not adopt the recommendations there. And of course, we've got a year to wait till our traffic filters go in, because Network Rail is doing some works and they don't want to risk putting in an experimental scheme where the sort of the baseline won't be in place for the experiment to be evaluated. So I think they want to make sure it's done by the book, because obviously there's risk of challenges to the traffic filters. It's a fairly dramatic scheme. And again, we're not sure how the politics will work out there, with Labor having left the governing coalition, unless they team up with the Conservatives to undermine it, which seems unlikely. I think we're okay. The county's already made the decision to install them. So the combined Labor, Lib Dem, Green cabinet made the decision last December to put the traffic filters in. So they don't need to do anything for that to happen, as it were. So I would say that most likely will go ahead in a year's time. But obviously, having seen what happened in Cambridge, there are always risks to these large schemes. Anyway, has anyone got any questions about that? Ruth?
No, I think she's going to make another comment.
Can I just say that Labour teaming up with Tories to screw active travel is exactly what happened in Brighton when they wanted to screw the other parties. So actually, Danny, I would watch out for them changing their mind quite dramatically.
Yeah, I think this is the trouble with these things, that they take so long, and the politics is so sensitive, and you don't, it's not done till it's done, is it? And we'll just keep our fingers crossed for you that it goes through. Thank you, Danny. Ruth, and I'll take this as the last news item, and we'll move on to our speaker after this.
Hugely positive news for a change. I'm in Holland, but today Cycleway 9 opened from Kew Bridge going west to Brentford. So yet another leg of Cycleway 9, thanks to the awesome councillors that we have and officers. So great news. I look forward to using it tomorrow. Thank you.
Great, another bit of good news. Thank you, Ruth. And so I think we'll move on to the speaker section of our session tonight. And as I mentioned, I'm really delighted to have John Parkin here, who is Emeritus Professor of Transport Engineering at the University of the West of England, and an author of a very important book, Designing for Cycle Traffic. And he's going to talk to us about educating engineers. So over to you, John.
Super. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. To some extent, I feel as though I'm a one-trick pony, and you probably know exactly what I'm going to say. But anyway, it probably is worth sort of iterating it. I'll say a little bit about myself just to begin with, so you understand where I'm coming from. And I am in danger here of sounding like a very bad curriculum vitae. I can say I was always interested in transport. If you were interviewing me for the job, as it were, I can really say that is true. And I'm going to show you now something. I don't know if you can see this. Here we go. Modern Transport. There were 10 editions came out between 1978 and 1980, quarterly, published by Ian Allen. It covered all forms of transport. And there were only 10. There were only a very few of us in the late 1970s as a schoolboy interested in all forms of transport. And Ian Allen obviously published about buses and rail as well. So I can claim to be always interested in transport. And in fact, for those of you who still live in Leicester, my very first advocacy letter was written to the Leicester Mercury, I think when I was in about the second or third year at school, extolling the virtues and benefits of cycling as a commute mode, which I've always been ever since. That is my default cycling. People talk to me about cycling, and I'm that unusual breed. I call myself a flat cap cyclist. But the Leicester Mercury editor was so taken with my letter that, in fact, he got the cartoonist to draw a cartoon to accompany the letter. I've since sent my mother to the archive to try and find the letter and the cartoon, but she spent hours in the archive, bless her, but she's not managed to find it. But there we go. And I was also a bus spotter in Leicester, so that's my background. Always been interested in transport. Then did a degree in civil engineering and worked in transport. Then I became part of the problem, in the sense that almost inevitably in the early 1980s, the work that was around was work linked with highways, as it still is. So I worked on the A3 Hindhead bypass in the early 80s, and it took another 20 years or so before it was complete. I worked on M25 widening, M60 box motorway, and so on and so forth, but was always very, in a sense, concerned that I was not necessarily doing the right thing. And of course, it was John Shaw and Ian Doherty in their book many years later, The Transport Debate. They said the car is all too capable of undermining its own utility. And I think that was very evident to me as a traffic and highway engineer. And we know that. So as transport engineers, I think actually we are, and I was, and many still are, part of what I call the automotive industrial complex. And that's a kind of very deliberate description. And you will realize that I'm, in a sense, comparing that with Eisenhower's valedictory speech in 1961 as the President of the United States of America. He said, "We must guard against the acquisition, I can't say, of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military industrial complex." So while the politicians were aware of the military industrial, I think the automotive industrial all industry complex, it's becoming obviously more obvious now as time has gone on, but in the 80s, 90s, noughties, that complex was there. And I think I, as a highway and traffic engineer, was sort of playing my part in that, potentially unwittingly. So things have changed. Cars are now commonly have masses in excess of 2 tons. There was discussion of that in one of the recent active travel cafes. And compare that with 617 kilograms, less than half the weight of an Austin Mini. And of course, the power to weight ratios have increased. So the nature of the beast, and maybe that's a very accurate description, has changed. But in a sense, many of the tools that we have are still the same. And I know this has been discussed. I will sort of just repeat. So in a sense, some of this is, repeating what you already know. But Ian Walker, Alan Tapp and Adrian Davis, 3 of my sort of professorial colleagues, 2 of whom at Ewing, one at Bath now, then Surrey and now Swansea, did the study about motor normativity. They posed 2 questions. People shouldn't drive in highly populated areas where other people have to breathe in their car fumes, and changing 2 words, people shouldn't smoke in highly populated and breathe in cigarette fumes. And you will know the results of this. When we change 2 words, drive to smoke and car to cigarette, the response rates change dramatically. So 17% said we shouldn't drive if it causes us breathing fumes, but 75% shouldn't smoke. And that is the basis of moto normativity. Why have I given you all of that big background? Well, it is patently clear that every student that I've taught lives in society and has been influenced by what they see and hear around them. So it is not the case that they come in neutral beings, as it were, for me to impose upon them my worldview. They come in with particularly, I'll give you 2 examples of 2 students. One was an HNC student many years ago when I taught at Bolton Institute. And how do you respond to this? So in class, I was talking about safety and speed and so on and so forth. And he said, well, if I drive home to Warrington fast, I'm on the road for a shorter period of time. So that's safer. Okay. Now, that was his worldview. That was how he approached it. So what you have to then do is sort of begin to go, okay, you've got to move to where he is. You've got to sort of move into his field of being, as it were, and slowly, gently take him on from there and point out to him that, in fact, the distance is fixed. And what he will be doing is passing every point along that route at a faster speed. And therefore, that will not be safer. So in a sense, you've got to change people's intellectual behaviors, and they're not neutral. They come loaded. I'll give you another example. Again, a student who's part-time here in Bristol is doing road safety audits on a junction on the ring road with them, a 50-mile-an-hour road, large signal control junction, a gradient going down to the traffic lights, and there was some, but not a lot, of rear-end shunt collision on the carriageway. And cycle traffic is on the adjacent footway on a narrow 3-meter footway. You know, too narrow, should be wider, should be better designed. So he's already working in the industry as a safety auditor in safety. His immediate reaction was to hone in on the cyclist and say, well, they're going down a gradient, they're creating a problem. We need to slow down the cycle traffic. But he had a 50-mile-an-hour road there, and the only problem at the junction was the potential for rear end shunts on the main carriageway. So again, you can see that the students come imbued, as it were. I'm making gross generalizations there, aren't I? But we all come with the back catalogue of what we have experienced. So I think I'll go back to what I said before. You've got to meet people where they are. You've got to gently then, I've got a phrase, walk empathetically. It's very posh, this, I don't know whether it's true or not. Walk empathetically in the cognitive shoes of your students. You've got to understand where they're at and move them on from there. And again, another phrase that comes to mind, I forget who quoted this, but basically facts have a liberal bias, but there is so much non-factual misinformation out there, which leads people to have a slightly different worldview. So you need to lead them on and be factual. So where are we? The car is still king. Everything is still done in terms of design, as you will know. I don't need to tell you, broadly speaking, in relation to the car, and is done for the car. What is left over then might be given to pedestrians and cyclists. That is still the default. That is still the norm. That is still the way it works. And if the width of a cycle route is inadequate, then it would be that width which is compromised and not the width for motor traffic. If safety is a problem, it'll be about slowing down the person cycling or putting barriers in their way. That is the default. That is what students come with a mind view. That is their worldview. I think the other point I would make, this leads into a more positive what's the solution to this? It leads into more positive now. The design manual for roads and bridges is a very complex document, not the one used for urban areas, but students ex-students still come to me and say, John, where's that bit in DLMRB that tells you about this, that, and the other? And this happened, fairly recently to me as well. And they will follow through to the nth degree in something like the DLMRB to find out exactly what to do. But when it comes to delivering for cycling, then they will likely as not take shortcuts, because that seems to be what happens as the default. So the first of my good news stories, and what I should do now is attempt to paste. Yeah, I think I have. Have I just pasted something that's quite long in the chat? I don't know. I'm able to see the chat there. Oh, I'm spinning down the chat. Has something appeared in the chat that's quite long with a numbered list? Hmm?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, I'll do that in a little. I'll do that in a little bit. I've got about 9, I think, published papers that I've written with students, and I'll post them in the chat. So if you're interested, you can go and take a look at those subsequently. The first was published in Proceedings. Well, it wasn't the first; it was the last. Actually, published in Proceedings at the Institution of Civil Engineers. And what he did, he was a junior engineer, again part-time. And he was getting frustrated by the fact that he was being controlled and coerced into not doing the best for cycling according to Local Transport Night 120. So his final year project was to explore the reasons for this, and he undertook a series of interviews, structured interviews with politicians, with program managers, project managers, and engineers and user groups to understand why there are constraints on applying LTM 120. And broadly speaking, he found that the constraints are limitations of funding, preventing large-scale outcomes, and the skill shortages. And I would want to add to that sort of behaviour shortages, but what he found was skill shortages. So there's a good news story there, that in a sense, this student got what was going on, understood the constraints, and then chose as his final year project to explore what some of those problems and issues were. That is an open access paper, so when I finally do publish it, you can have a look at it. Another student of mine, in fact, was Brian Deegan, but I would rather say that probably I learnt more from him than he learnt from me, but maybe we argue about that, but anyway, there we go. And the fourth paper on that list that I'll post in a moment was one that I wrote with Brian Deegan about network planning about 10 years ago. So there are other papers as well. These are the sorts of things students have researched with me, measuring the influence of on-road features on driver behavior. So that's things like cycle lanes and road signs and speed limits on drivers overtaking cyclists, the effects of cycle lane widths, design speeds, acceleration characteristics of cycles, studies around inclusivity for blind and visually impaired people, and methods for assessing routes for cycle traffic, equestrian collisions, and design approaches. This got a bit detailed and very technical around road sign reflectivity. So those are the good news stories. You won't have every student who sort of gets the message, but part of, I think, how to make sure that you engender behavior change in students is, well, completely understand your own subject, but be enthusiastic about it, be factual, and demonstrate by example. So what I will do now is just share my screen, and I have a couple of slides which will which I'll talk through in just a moment. Precursor to that, though, civil engineering degrees are accredited by the Joint Board of Moderators, which is a joint body between the Institution of Structural Engineers, Institute of Civil Engineers, Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation, and Institute of Permanent Way Engineers. So you see there's quite a transport bias. 3 out of 4 or 3 out of 5 are transport institutions. And what the JBM emphasizes now is that degree programs should be design-led, and that carbon is really important. I'll come back to carbon in a moment. As an educator, I think you need to understand your own strengths and weaknesses. If I would say my strength and weakness is I'll describe myself as a jack of all trades. So broadly speaking, I have done nearly everything, and I stretch myself across the whole gamut through from analysis through to design. So I think, if anything, that is the way that educators do need to be. We need to be sort of extensive across the piece. But I suspect, if anything, my bias is towards being analytical. But what the Joint Board of Moderators is rather insisting on is that education of engineers is now design-based through project-based learning, which I think is a good idea. What I also want to do then is just emphasize that the Joint Board of Moderators really emphasizes the carbon issue. They say this in bold up front in their degree accreditation guidelines. They say this: we see the extraordinary challenge of the climate emergency as a very necessary cultural feature. I'll repeat that: a very necessary cultural feature in the education of civil engineering students, and our guidelines should be read with this strong intent in mind. So underpinning everything now within civil engineering education, these revised guidelines came out 2 years ago, is the whole issue of the climate emergency. And that's a bit of a wake-up call to us. So I'll pick up a couple of examples a bit later on to highlight that. But I think the other point I will make just before launching into this comparison of sort of the old and the new, as it were, is that traffic engineering, if I can call it that for a moment, is both technical but also political. And the introductory news that we've heard, I've heard you speak about, it's all political. You know, that is the angle that you come from. There are technical aspects to it as well. However, in a sense, what we are doing is training technical people, engineers, to enter the domain of what I will call social engineering. You know, what we build will influence how people behave. That, to quite a few engineers, I think, is a bit scary. You know, they would prefer to get back in the burrow and do what everybody's always done because they couldn't be then accused of trying to change things. But in a sense, engineering is about changing things. So, okay, the final part now, fairly briefly, I'll just talk you through. I mean, broadly speaking, I've always taught throughout my career, or beyond this, but two major modules, one around traffic engineering, as it used to be called, and one around highway and railway engineering as well, combined. So traffic engineering, on the left-hand side of the slide there that you see are the subject headings, which would have traditionally been part of traffic engineering: data collection, safety, junction design, link design. Now, what we have done at UE and what I have done with work with the Joint Board of Moderators, and also through my role as chairing accreditation panels for the Joint Board, is go around to different universities and help them move on, help them move into project-based learning, and help them move into design-based learning, around a newer curriculum, which is focused more holistically on street design. So for traffic survey techniques, we now move into, you know, movement data collection using technology. We move away from safety into talking about road danger reduction, principally through the issue of speed management. We talk about holistic street design for all. We talk about motor traffic reduction and area-wide traffic management. We use the urban design tools, Manual for Streets and Local Transport Note 120, whereas 10 years ago, I would be using Design Manual for Roads and Bridges. And we talk about modeling with micro-simulation rather than necessarily with models that only look at motor traffic flow. And then, I've just realised I've not put it on. I've not put it on presenter view, but anyway, there we go. It doesn't matter. So on this second module, it would have been highway and railway engineering, but this just deals with highway engineering. So this is about the alignment design, the geometry, and it's also about the construction, the materials used in the highway road surface, and so on and so forth. What do we need to move to? My suspicion is it's around highway management. I've been privileged to be a member of the Roads Review panel in Wales. In Wales now, you can only build a road according to four conditions. The first condition is, will it create more active travel? The second is, will it respond to the issues of resilience caused by climate change? And there are a couple of others I can't just recall, but I mentioned the top two because obviously they're very relevant for tonight. But that second one about resilience to climate change is really important. So I do know, I can name it, it's in the public domain. There's a road in West Wales in Pembrokeshire, I've just forgotten the name, Newgale, which will be washed away within 10 years, and there will be a new road built. That meets the criteria because we do need still to connect Haverfordwest with St David's, but there are many other roads which aren't going ahead, you know, on that basis. So I think it's about sort of asset management. It's about adaptation asset management and renewal. I'm not talking about this in a very logical order, but there are a few things. I've come in with the climate chaos to begin with there, haven't I, about flooding control, and it's not a popular subject in civil engineering. Management of the existing, it's always sexier to build new, but it's going to become, and is already important to deal with asset management. Talk a bit about adaptation there. So, things are changing. It's about creating more cycling pedestrian routes. And I'll jump down to the bottom there, renewals. It became clear to me that I didn't know enough about carbon in the built infrastructure. So in the last couple of years, I've been educating myself quite a lot on that. There are now tools out there. National Highways and RSSB have a tool for the rail industry to estimate the amount of carbon embedded in infrastructure. We can do that now. We're quite good at that. But what we're not good at is then using the amount of carbon embedded in infrastructure to understand how we should change what we're building. So I think I'll probably draw to a close there and super summarize by saying I've come a long way in my career. I've converted my career in many different ways. Today's students will need to convert their careers in many different ways. We have already now changed our curricula. I think they're better suited to the next generation and what we need to do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was fantastic. And I have a lot of questions, but I'm sure other people have too. If you welcome to put hands up or put questions in the chat, whatever you would prefer. But I was going to ask you, in terms of kind of thinking about your intake, is there something around how degrees are advertised as well, which is going to attract certain people? And I wonder, to what extent do you think those degrees are being advertised, differently? Is that happening, or are they really going to appeal to people who perhaps are more interested in motoring?
Yeah. I think a few things to respond to on that. My career has been unusual in the sense it started at the Bolton Institute. 85% of our students were part-time. They came via an HNC route and then a part-time degree route. And they very often tended to be, because they were part-time, people who had then got experience in industry, were recognised as being appropriate for continuing onto degrees by their employers. So they very often came from very interesting backgrounds and not necessarily from your, physics and maths A-level background. That meant they had a broader purview of the world. So in a sense, I'm not the best person to ask it. But equally then, it is recognised, and I'll give a further example of degree apprentices, which is quite a significant part of the cohort now at University of the West of England. The government recognised that the industry wasn't educating part-time as perhaps it should. But what that has generated is the big players in the market, the big consultancies and local authorities are recruiting from A-level some of the very best students who realise that they can get a degree without getting into multiple £1,000s worth of debt, and learning while they're earning. And they're brilliant students as well. I love teaching them. So some of them, and I'll just give one example, not only as well as maths, she did art at A-level, and she had a real flair for design. So there is an awful lot that, the wider the pool for civil engineering, the better. But what tends to happen, this grieves me, at master's level, what I tend to find anyway, that my experience from UE is that there are many people interested in the environment and transport, but then they go and do an environmental management MSc or something like that, but then, quote unquote, end up in transport. And I think personally, I would say this, wouldn't I, missed out because they will not have been grounded in many of the, I'll say, competing theories about transport, including, the economist worldview of transport and travel and all the rest of it. Sorry, that's a very long answer, but
Yeah.
I think it's a more diverse cohort than you might think.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it will always be the case that there are the right people that are attracted and the wrong people, but they'll self-sort themselves out in due course, I think. Yeah.
And I think you've touched on the fact that there are all of these different courses which are kind of overlapping. If you're going to go and do urban design, or then you kind of merging it, going into landscape design, then of course you have planning, and there's there's almost a case for, and I guess for those institutions that offer all of those, there's a possibility that you share some modules, but there are elements of it. I mean, I teach some undergraduate planning, and planners will get a lot of kind of the right to the city, and a lot of that kind of.
I nearly put my foot in it there, did I?
And the theory side of it, but everybody sits in their kind of silo, really, and there's obviously, not only do they have to all work together, when they go off into the real world, there's elements of it that I guess everybody could be doing together.
You make a really good point there about silos, and equally and oppositely, then we get some students coming to us on the master's program who say, why are you telling me about all this policy stuff? I just want to build roads, So, it is challenging.
Yeah. I'm going to bring in I can see a couple of hands up, Adam and then Mark. Do you want to mute questions or comments?
Yeah, I noticed that in the sorry, I've got a bit of a cold flu thing going on. And the active travel capability scoring, they are using an indicator called to see whether or not highways departments or authorities are using decide and provide rather than predict and provide. Are you seeing? I'm assuming that's basically Active Travel England trying to encourage highways authorities to think more about the type of traffic they want rather than what to accommodate what's happening. Are you seeing that outside? Are you seeing that generally becoming a more normalization of that thinking, or because it sounds like there's always like, I don't want to say a paradigm shift between the type of thinking or going away from, anyway, what I'm about.
Yeah. I think, well, in a sense, you're talking about practice there, but in a sense that I can't answer that from a university point of view. But however, one of the other roles I have is a commissioner for the North Wales Transport Commission, which is all about looking at what is now provided. That is about decide and provide for North Wales now that roads aren't being built. So I'm seeing it there. But what I will say is I talk principally about undergraduate civil engineering, but I have also taught obviously on master's programs in transport, and we touch on policy issues at undergraduate, but at postgraduate we will touch on a lot more the whole issue of transport appraisal and how you go about deciding what you want to build and what services you want to put in place. I had to split the reading list into 3 because it was too long to post in one go. I now realise it.
They've all come through now. That's great. Thank you. Mark, have you got a question?
So we're delivering the Institute of Highway Engineers LTN, or active travel module, but it's focused on LTN 120 training. But that's a CPD, continuous professional development training. So it's not quite the same as what John is talking about. This is people who are already on the job and are being sent off to do this either because they want to retrain or because their employers, often we know that, make them do that because they're moving into doing active travel. Some of the people on it are really keen and interested, and you can tell the ones who've been sent by their employers because they're the ones who just sit through the whole course being grumpy and trying to lob hand grenades in every time we try to discuss things. How can we integrate that? And other courses are available from other institutions. I should point that out. And we're not the only ones doing it. But how can we integrate that with the degree side of things? Because the CPD stuff is a 4-day course, which is nowhere near going to be, the level of detail that you get on a degree. But you come out of it with a certification that you've got an active travel certification. So you can then go away and say, aha, I can now do all this stuff. And hopefully we are giving people a good basis. But it's not the same as a degree, is it?
No, don't run away with the idea that we could teach them a lot more on a degree about cycle design than you could on a 4-day course, though. That will be a fallacy, because on the degree, we still got to teach them about an awful, even on a transport module, about an awful lot else besides cycling, because cycling isn't the whole world, But just as an example, I now certainly do at undergraduate and postgraduate different, well, I don't, I'll pass it on to colleagues, but design projects based around them designing, it's over, 500 meters, half a kilometer in one instance, and probably a kilometer in another instance, a cycle network, and then in more detail, routes. So they're beginning to grapple with it. However, of course, they have no other, unlike your CPD trainees, they have no other experience of doing anything like that at all. So you're starting from in a sense, a much lower base, although you are introducing cycling to them and design for pedestrians as one of the first things that they do, rather than anything else. So it's sort of horses for courses, and there will always be, absolutely. I mean, I did, every one of us on the call, if we're a professional in any field, will have done CPD postgraduate, and that is because you do not learn everything that you need to learn on a degree. And it's the old adage, isn't it? I probably learned less in the 3 years on the degree than I did in the 3 years that I spent in my immediate first 3 years postgraduate. So I think it's a false analogy to say we could teach more. We can't. There's a massive need and role for in-job CPD training like you're doing, Mark.
Thanks, John. I can see, Ruth, you've got a hand up. I'll take your question, then I'm going to take a few because there's quite a few in the chat. So you want to ask yours first? Awesome.
Oh, yeah. Hi. Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute. Thanks, John. Very interesting. Two things. One, I would say that, yes, it's not all about cycling, but if all engineers cycled before they were allowed to design anything, they really, really would get a handle of what it's like to be outside a tin box, whether it's walking, wheeling, in a bus, whatever. Cycling would really show them an awful lot. So my question is, do you show them tools for when council's officers will say no to something that is safe? Because we know that an awful lot of stuff gets cancelled from design point of view because of local objections or NIMBYism or whatever we like to call it. So do you get them to think around how they might be able to influence the changes they need? Thank you.
Yeah, we certainly do attempt to get them to think, in that broader way. But in a sense, my response is similar to the response to Mark a moment ago. You've almost got to tell them that it could be this or it could be that, and then tell them that actually there will be different worldviews out there. You need to, in a sense, to absolutely tell them everything. So I think what you did there, Ruth, is construct quite a construction about something that I absolutely get and understand. But in a sense, the picture of that real world that you're painting, you would then have to paint to them and say, this is the real world of conflicting views, and this might happen and that might happen, and all the rest of it. Now, is it worth spending time doing that? Or is it worth spending time making sure that they understand the basis and the logic of what the design guidance is telling them? This is what I'm driving at. It would take a lot of time to construct a scenario like that. But having said that, that is the basis of, in a sense, project-based learning. And not infrequently in design projects in civil engineering, we will, and I've done it like this in the past, not in the context of transport, but you will construct a brief for them, and they have, the whole semester or the whole year or whatever to do it. And then about week 6, you'll come in and say, the client's changed his mind. They want this now. And then, so, there is the possibility, absolutely, bringing an element of what you're talking about into, the jeopardy, as it were, of getting on, going down one road and then having to jump horses because somebody's changed their mind. Yeah.
Thank you, Ruth. I'll take some of the questions from the chat. Somebody has asked, is there a shift towards training transport engineers to be more collaborative with other professionals?
Yeah, good question. And I might be provocative here, but I know that we're probably the worst profession in many ways. It is true of other professions working with us as well, is it not? So it's that silo working that you've already referred to, Sally, I think. But yeah, absolutely. And certainly on the master's program, we have people from not just civil engineering backgrounds, from all sorts of backgrounds, including geography. You know, one of our best students one year was a linguist, so his life trajectory was that he studied German, worked in Germany, ended up working in admin in one of the big civil engineering consultants. They recognized his talent, they sponsored him. He said he had some interest in transport because he was administering projects in that, and they sponsored him through an MSc in transport, and he was one of our best students. But the last time he did maths was, you know, way back when at A level, and so but he was one of the better ones at modelling, I think, and so on and so forth. So yes, it is, and we do in the final year, in the third year undergraduate, as a joint project between so in the school there's civil engineering and planning, so the joint project between the civil engineers and the planners. At previous universities I've had joint projects between civil engineers and quantity survey. You know, it sort of depends how the university is structured, but you certainly can create modules where you've got students from different disciplines working together, you know, in complementary ways. But group working in students, it's tricky.
Very challenging. Important, but challenging.
Yes, important but tricky. Yes.
I'm going to whip through these. So somebody's asked, a council transport planner in Stirling has said the biggest block on building active travel infrastructure is the lack of engineers who know how to. And that, I think that you talked about a student who'd done some kind of research into that found that as well. Are colleges increasing the number of students to fill that gap?
Yeah, so I'll say yes and no. I'll just go back to what I was saying about the joint board earlier. Obviously, I'm, you know, an evangelist for this within the university sector, and it is changing. There's a brilliant guy, for example, Ali, can't remember his surname, Ali Mook something, at Glasgow University, completely redid their curriculum. We do what we do at UE. There's somebody over at Coventry who, in a conversation I had with him on a JBM accreditation visit, completely got it and went away and redid their curriculum. I will not mention other universities, but and some of the quote unquote what you might think of better universities. There is one university, for example, whose higher end traffic engineering is still done in the same way it could have well been done in the late 1970s, and their design projects is about designing a road to the local airport.
Yeah, and what are the institutes then doing? You know, the accrediting institutes, are they able to do much about that?
Yeah. We can kick, cajole, and influence, but broadly speaking, of course, you will realise that universities are autonomous bodies, so it's not like having a curriculum imposed on you by the government, thankfully. So within the parameters set down by the joint board, you can do what you like, and there is an awful lot of what is custom and practice in terms of what is done. But obviously a lot of that custom and practice in terms of what is being done now needs to change because of, you know, carbon and what I've said to you there. And some universities are responding more quickly than others, and very often it's about skills base. So in a sense, for those of you who you know, I'm going to sound divisive here, sheep and goats, but those of you who have qualifications in this sort of thing, do not be afraid to offer your skills to local universities and say, I could go in and just give a couple of sessions for you, on this subject. It might lead to something and something else and something else. But we do need, let me start in a slightly different position. Universities teach both theory and practice. So civil engineering is a directed subject in the sense that it's directed towards the practice of civil engineering. So therefore, it does need to be taught by practitioners. And the Joint Board recognises that many of the people I talked about being a jack of all trades and analysts and design go to some other universities. They are heavily analytical. They have few, and when I say few, I mean really few people who have quote unquote real world experience of consultancy, design, local authority. So they struggle when they come to needing to deliver practical design projects around things like traffic engineering and cycling and walking and all the rest of it. So if you're able, in a position to be able to, they'll probably bite your arm off in some wouldn't, because they'll just want to carry on doing what they've always done. So it's through influence rather than diktat that the accreditation bodies can work, and there's a lot further to go on that, even with quote unquote the good universities.
Yeah. And I've got that kind of leans onto these two questions that I'll put together because they're sort of related. Somebody says, seems to me engineers being the problem is primarily as a result of not understanding second order impacts of their projects. To what degree do you think they should be taught about behavioural sciences and its predictable outcomes, e.g. Appleyard's demo 69 demo of more cars in the street meaning less friends, as opposed to bolstering the status of specialists in those fields? And then the second question is, how much do engineers get trained in democracy and politics, Nolan principles, dealing with the public, etc.? And you've touched on bits of that before, but I guess I was also thinking that, how do they get much theory? What does theory look like, I guess? Because you touched on that, but what does that look like for transport?
So at master's level, yes, to all of what has been said there, changing travel behaviour, policy, politics, finance, policy making, all of that gets covered. At undergraduate civil engineering, you may have those sorts of things dealt with either specifically within transport. I certainly talk about them when I'm, teaching, but they may be treated more generally. But specifically, no. Behavioural sciences is not taught, and in a sense, policy might only be the first half of the first lecture on something or other. So I'm probably going off on a bit of a tangent here, but in the field of hydraulics, there's such a lot to cover, but sustainable urban drainage is really important. So you will cover it, but then the policy that deals with that might just be a few sentences at the beginning. We're doing this because, and you're lucky sometimes if you get that, and then you get into the how you do it rather than the why you're doing it. So yes, there is a strong case that we should be getting more of the why we're doing this, which is the policy in there. But that would create an awful lot of debate amongst the engineering community about how much of that you would do, if you know what I'm driving at.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to take this final question from the chat and then go to Bob. So this final question is, how can we ensure the good modern training isn't immediately beaten out of students when they start working for senior and likely older engineers? Not saying all older engineers would do this.
Yeah. My feeling on that is that it is the institutions. So as one example, just a couple of weeks ago, I helped with a lunchtime seminar for the Institution of Civil Engineers for graduates who are going for their professional review, and they have to write a piece of writing as though it were, and there are 6 options. I can't remember, letters to school children, letters to politicians, or briefing notes or blogs, or different styles of writing. And then the subject matter is broadly what traditionally has been called the engineering society. So it's going back to that previous question that we just had about. And I think some of the best support that recent graduates can get when they're not in an environment which is forward-thinking and conducive to other, would be through their peers, through graduates, graduates forums in the institutions. But maybe that's a weak answer. But ultimately, things will change. And what's the other line? The budget line is the sincerest form of policy statement or something. And we know where the budget lines are going now towards it. So that will begin to influence behaviours, continue to influence behaviours as we go forward. So as we see the money flow, we'll see the behaviours change, I would argue as well.
Yeah, always follow the money.
Yeah.
Bob, have you got a question for John?
Yeah, it's more of a comment really on this point about second order, because I did second order effects, and it's also backing up what John said about going to speak to people in universities. He was very good enough to get me to give a session on one of his master's degrees when he was in London. And I used to do some for Rachel Aldred. And I remember one of the times when I went in, and, you do get this sort of mix between the people who are like the people here and the people who are engineers, who are basically only there because they were told to do it. And you can kind of see it on the expression of their faces. And I was doing a lot about risk compensation, which is, about second order effects, displacement, accident migration, so on, so on, so on. And I always remember this one lad, because I'd been describing it in terms which engineers could understand, I gave the example of pedestrian guardrail removal, and he kind of twigged on that. It got through to him. So it's about how you relate it to their experience as engineers. And yeah, you can do it, even if they're not your sort of the kind of person you would have got as your ideal target audience.
Can I just say that's a really good example, Bob, of what I was saying earlier. You've got to meet them where they are, and then slowly move them forward. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's all of the questions. Just only to say that there's been quite a lot of discussion in the chat about the need for all of these disciplines to learn from each other, or perhaps work more closely together. So yeah, I'm sure everybody would want to join me in saying a huge thank you. That was really, really interesting, and it's really encouraging to hear that that things are changing, at least on some courses, and that hopefully this is like the beginning of a very positive change, much more widely. And thank you very much for joining us. If you are able to share your slides, John, we can post them on the website.
Absolutely. Yes, I can. I think, is that Scott Arthur as Harriet Watt? You should have come in, Scott, and given us the benefit. I did a PhD examination with Scott a few years ago. I realise you're all very quiet and backward in coming forwards. And Graham, I noted, I'm just going through the chat. Yeah, lots of really good comments. Thank you. And thank you for giving me so much time in the end as well. There wasn't a second speech and we started early. So that was quite nice to have quite an extended period just to discuss it. So thank you for the time.
Yeah, no, thank you. And then so it's just left for me to let you all know what's happening next week. So next week we have Rob Collier, who's from Bike Worcester, who's going to talk about setting up bike buses, having done so for 7 schools in Worcester with the support of Worcester City Council. So please do spread the word about that, because I know that there is some interest from we've heard from people who want to hear about how you go about doing that. And on that note, I will let you all go, and thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.